Hello and welcome back to the Comic Lyra podcast, where we comically and literally look at comics. I'm Ryan, also known as Comic Stan. I love comic books, but my co-host loves regular books, and then I make him read the comic books that we talk about. And with me, as always, is my aforementioned resurrected co-host, it's Jamie.
I saw you struggling there.
I see you lying down in a prone position.
I'm just relaxed in a hood. I'm just, at my leisure, reclined, wearing a hood.
Well, I'm sitting upright and at a good posture. Because I'm at an age now where if I don't do that, my body falls apart.
Ah, yes. The old rot of time.
I'm at an age now where I can sleep and get an injury. Like, that's the reality for anyone who's listening under 30.
I'm at an age now where I went on a stag do at the weekend. We were in bed by 11:30 every night and we still had a good time.
That's just responsible fun.
It was very responsible fun.
Good, clean, responsible fun. And speaking of responsible fun, we're looking at Marvel comics from the 80s.
Yeah, where everyone was on cocaine and yet the comic books were still boring.
Well, that gives you a little preview of how we're thinking about this comic. And speaking of the comic, we are, of course, talking about the original Daredevil, Born Again, from the 80s, which is an inspiration for some of the Daredevil TV stuff they're doing right now, but also it's talked about a lot as one of the best Daredevil comics. I'm not going to go so far as to say, like, with All-Star Superman, it's the best, like, it's the consensus best or anything like that. I looked up, like, to see online what the consensus was, and it was a lot of different options.
Yeah.
So we're not having another situation of, this is the best of this character, what do you think? And you're like,
But it's a well-regarded one, isn't it?
It's well-regarded. I think it's a highlight of a run by a creator who's credited with doing the best work on the character, if that makes sense.
I can kind of see why it's highly regarded. It's not bad.
Well, that's going to be an interesting conversation to get into, at least. So,
why, do you not like it?
No, I loved it, but, loved is strong. I really liked it, but this is the thing I think we're going to get into. I think it's going to be the first topic once we get past the credits, is assessing something from a different time. I think that's going to be like a big point to start off with. But speaking of the credits, this is one by a renowned comic book creator by Frank Miller.
Yeah.
Do you recognize that name at all?
I do, yeah.
He most probably well known for The Dark Knight Returns, which is one of the big three mainstream use of the term graphic novel.
Yeah.
So he's most well known for that, and definitely for Sin City, which...
Oh, okay. He did that.
That comic, and then those film adaptations, which were like so close to... It was, for when they came out, it was unusual for a movie adaptation to be so close to the comic.
Right.
Because, I mean, you've seen the films, Sin City?
Are they the ones?
Visually, you would know them. Like,
they have the younger one from the Gilmore Girls in it.
No. I don't even know who that is.
1 minute.
Had Jessica Alba in.
I don't know who that is.
You don't. I think it's weirder to not know who Jessica Alba is from our age, because she was big when we were like adolescent teens watching films.
Well, I know who she is because Eminem talked about her.
That's a very unique way to know a celebrity.
The person I was talking about is Alexis Bledel, who was in them. She was Becky.
Fair enough. I didn't recognize her.
So yes, I have seen Sin City.
Fair enough. But you see, like, that very unique visual thing.
Yeah, it was like
films.
Noir, black and white, kind of.
Very, very similar to the comic. So that's kind of the Frank Miller style he's known for his art.
Cool.
But we're talking about his writing, because he wrote this. He was a very prominent writer on Daredevil for a lot of the 80s. I think he's regarded as one of the best, definitely most well-known Daredevil writers. He kind of made the character like one of the most popular ones. Daredevil. The one we're talking about this week.
Oh, it's just because you said Deadpool.
Oh, fuck's sake. Well, I'm going to probably make that mistake a fair bit, but Daredevil actually became more famous in the 80s because of Frank Miller's writings.
Darepool or Dead Devil?
Daredevil sounds weirder than Darepool. Darepool sounds like a college sorority or fraternity kind of thing.
Yeah, you have to pick a dare out.
Darepool, man. It's like, oh, there's bodily fluids in there. You have to pick a dare out of the Darepool. Yeah. Ew.
I like that you thought of it as an actual pool.
Oh, yeah.
Like, is the pool where the dares happen?
Yeah.
You get in the dare pool and then do what?
Well, knowing a fraternity, probably not great things. Definitely not legal things.
I'm really glad I went to university in the UK where we didn't have that.
I think some do, but in like a really faux American kind of like, look, we're doing it too kind of way.
Because I think 18-year-old Jamie at university would have definitely wanted to live in a frat house.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Because they make it look appealing, like all the college American films and stuff like that.
Well, no, because they're hotbeds for sexual violence, aren't they?
Well, that was a left turn. I mean, you're right, but I wouldn't have gone into it on this podcast.
Yeah, that's my only knowledge of them, is that they're really awful places. But I think 18-year-old Jamie wouldn't have known that.
No, and that's what I meant by most of any age group at that age would just know them as like the, American Pie, what's the old Animal House from the 80s, like that kind of like guys just being dudes and don't peek beneath the curtain because it's real bad back there.
Yeah, don't look under the bed because you'll see all the tissues.
I mean, that's probably the least bad thing they're doing. Anyway, back to Daredevil, which I'm going to watch myself now. Daredevil. But Frank Miller, very prominent writer, kind of made him most popular in the 80s. So I think this one being such a well-regarded comic is because it's kind of almost a culmination of his 80s work. What's very interesting is almost made me choose a different comic to do this week, because in the 90s he came back to the title.
Right.
Do you want to guess who the artist was he had?
Was it John Romita Jr.?
It was John Romita Jr., yeah.
I'm glad you didn't do that.
It was tempting to see if you'd notice, because apparently that's his better art, but that's another episode. And if you would pin it as the specific bad art that you recognize from your previous experience of his work.
I like to have faith in myself and my taste that I would have noticed.
But then it would have been unreasonable for you to just be like, it's bad. And then if I was like, it's John Romita Jr., you went, well, that explains it. Like, that level is fine. But like, I think it's asking you a bit much to be like, this smells like John Romita Jr.'s work. Like, that would have been a bit much. But yes, but luckily we've got a different artist on this, and luckily we've got a different artist to Frank Miller, because Frank Miller does some artwork himself. He's done some good stuff. He's also done some real bad stuff as well.
Is Frank Miller the Captain America guy?
No, you're thinking of Ed Brubaker.
I'm thinking of Ed Brubaker.
Yes, but the artist on this is one David Mazzucchelli. So starting with the arting, or do you want to do kind of the more kind of general stuff?
We can start with the art.
Let's starting with the arting then. What do you think of the art?
All right.
Very 80s of its time.
I'm going to struggle with this episode. This is going to be an episode where I'm constantly trying to drag you off topic, because...
As opposed to...
No, sometimes I get involved.
glad to hear that from my co-host.
Sometimes I get on board with the whole concept here. But it was fine, I suppose. It wasn't bad.
Well, this is kind of what I was going to get into. And this relates to the art and the story.
I think it's hard for me to, in my head, sort of see this coming from the same decade as something like The Killing Joke.
The problem with... You use The Killing Joke a lot as an example, but the problem is that it's such a unique thing.
That's the point I was going to get to. Is that...
We're on the same level.
But you interrupted me.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You make me do this podcast every week, and then you don't let me finish.
I only interrupt because you go on wild tangents, and then I'm like, can we go back to this point? And you're like, oh, jazz, though. And I'm like, no, but I had a point like 10 minutes ago.
The tangents are fun, and I think you should get more on board with the tangents and just let it... This isn't a canal that has been cut in a certain direction. This is organic, like a river. It's a natural process.
As long as you don't mind me being like, by the way, I was going to say something 10 minutes ago, so we're going to go circle back to this point.
What, are you going to get canally?
What on earth are you trying to say?
I'm trying to say anally retentive, but torturing the canal pun. It was going to be canally retentive, but I couldn't work out a way to make it sound like canal.
To be honest, I don't think the end result was worth justifying the effort.
No. So I found it hard in my head to reason this being coming from the same decade as The Killing Joke, because that was just so far in advance of it. But then I realized that The Killing Joke was breaking the mold, and that this is what it was a response to. And
also which art of The Killing... Oh, you're talking about the original art of The Killing Joke. Because we both, when we did The Killing Joke, we both had a thing where like, oh, we know this art, but that was like a 2008 redo from the original artist or something.
And the original art's wild. It's fantastic.
Yeah. But again, it's such a different... I think this is more, comparable to something like Craven's Last Hunt, Spider-Man one we did.
Yeah.
Because they're more similar in the what was at the time the Marvel House style.
Didn't I quite like how that looked though? Yeah,
and I think that was a lot darker, and I don't mean tonally. I think literally like it had more like nighttime stuff.
So this really put me in mind of like Action Comics 38, like first appearance of Batman. Like in terms of what it looked like a lot older than it was to me. It looked like it could have. It looked like it could have been from the 30s or 40s.
It was very 80s, but I think maybe it's because I've read more 80s comics. But like the color scheme on this is very 80s, maybe even 70s. And to be fair, I saw some stuff from the 60s which looks pretty similar to this. I think they did have like a very similar style from like spanning a few decades.
Yeah.
But like 30s, I think goes a bit too far for me in terms of comparison.
But yeah, it didn't look terrible, but neither did I find much that visually compelling. And one of the things that I actually missed was splash panels.
There was a couple, but very rare.
Yeah.
There's like maybe one an issue, if that.
Much more rare than they are in modern comics. But I think the process is a lot faster in modern comics because they're all created digitally. Whereas this is old enough that it would have been pen on paper. This would have been ink on paper.
You can also tell the moments where they use just a white background, so they don't have to do the extra. And there's some moments where, for me, that actually does work better, where some moments you could just tell they just want to save a bit of time and it was fine. But there's like one specific moment with Matt Murdock fighting the Kingpin, and that's a white background. I feel like that works there because it really does highlight, like, this is very important what's going on. The only thing that matters are these two and they're fighting. Like, that was a more memorable fight than ones where they did the backgrounds, because this one felt like it almost like happened in a void because, again, nothing else matters in that moment. Then there's other times where they just were saving time not doing the background. Maybe it's happy accident kind of thing.
It does have some moments where the art is quite cinematic as well. And I use that term really loosely because, of course, how could this be cinematic? But I'm thinking of that moment where we skip to Matt Murdock sleeping in a skip with a bunch of homeless people.
Yes.
And it kind of cuts to that right at the start of an issue. And that felt like, to me in my mind, it felt like that is exactly where, if I was doing this as a 6-episode miniseries for the Beeb, that is where I would have opened episode 4. That is exactly where I would have opened episode 4, panning out to Matt Murdock quite literally at rock bottom, asleep in a skip with a bunch of other rough sleepers. And so there are some moments where the story's really pulling the weight, where the art is really pulling the weight, pulling its weight in the storytelling endeavor.
Yes.
That was a clunky sentence.
You got there in the end.
I got there. But it's more about how you fly than how you land, isn't it?
That's what a phrase to use right now in this climate.
Well, fuck, yeah. But no, I mean, I don't know that I disliked it. I found it largely uninspiring to look at.
But then with that, and then this is a hypothetical that I don't think we can really truly answer. Is it a case of comic book art being so of its time in any decade that if you're experienced to like the modern art, comic book art, this will underserve because you're used to so much, like increasing techniques and digital art and everything like that. Like they can literally accomplish more with less.
And that's a thought that I had, which is that I tried to put myself in the shoes of a good consumer in the 1980s who wasn't reading this off of a screen and was going to a comic book store, leafing through the first 3 pages and ultimately buying the issue. And I can see how the art would have been effective then because it was bright and it was punchy. And for the most part, everything was where it should be. I know I hark on about this a lot.
Very consistent.
Yeah, it was, wasn't it? It was relatively consistent. I think Matt Murdock was quite consistent. I don't particularly like Daredevil's costume design from the era. I think it's too red.
Right.
And that's certainly something they've addressed in more modern iterations where he has a slightly darker costume, doesn't he?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's a across the board 80s, 60s to 80s thing. Like they were all, it was that thing where you say, you bang on about the outlines being recognizable. This was very much as soon as you see the character, you know who it is. So when it's all red, you're like Daredevil, like immediately.
The other thing that I just need to address, I'm done talking about art, by the way.
Okay.
Because I have a question.
So shall I get into all my art stuff before we move on then?
Oh, okay. You have notes.
I had a couple of bits which I thought were particularly good. As I said, some moments were very That's one bit where it wasn't as consistent, but I think very intentionally. Lot of details in some panels, and then, like I say, some were very simplified.
Yeah.
Probably because I think the artist especially was putting the time and effort where they thought it mattered most, and then not even half-assing it, but intentionally simplifying it on bits that were just like, yeah, let's just get this part kind of done out of the way to focus on this part. There was these kind of close-ups, which I thought, like the facial detail, I'm showing a picture of like the Kingpin at one point, but a lot of like menace in his face, which is normally quite obstructed. Like you don't see a lot of his face most of the time. So a lot of little bits like that. And then especially some of the more frantic looking parts of Daredevil losing his mind.
Yes.
I think they sparingly use some very detailed panels to get across that feeling while not having to do it in every single panel.
Yeah.
So like points like that, I thought that's really good there. And I think the limitations of the time and the effort they could put in and stuff, I think that owes a lot to what we're kind of almost spoiled with in the modern age compared to then. Like how
do you
much
think we're
us
spoiled
can
as
do.
consumers?
I mean, compared to the 80s, like we look, put it this way, some stuff we reviewed and we go, it's kind of mid, like art-wise. If you show that to someone in the 80s, they'd be like, this is the best comic I've ever seen. And it's that kind of difference, you know?
Yes, I suppose. I mean, was there more or less comic book content then than there is now? Is it a broader market now?
I'd say yes, especially because of the internet. Like even outside the big two, who obviously are able to print more now than they ever have before.
Yeah.
Outside of that, you've got people who are making comics that never get a physical release.
Yeah.
So internet-wise, it's just there's way more just generally existing now than there was in the 80s.
So there is a broader market, which in itself necessitates higher quality, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, that makes sense to a certain degree. I think it's hard when you're talking about older stuff, isn't it? Because
this is what I say about story.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean,
a lot
we'll
of
get
stuff
into
is
that.
of its time. A lot of the stuff is that Abe Simpson of because it was the style at the time. You see,
yes,
like, a lot of they just did stuff like that because that's how they did it. Then.
And this is nearly 50 years old, isn't it?
Yep.
It's getting on for being 50 years old.
It's 86, so it's 40 years old. Only because we're right at the 40-year mark almost.
Yeah, it'll be 40 years old next year. Got it? Is it 2025 or 2026?
It's 2025 currently.
2025.
And I only know that because of Marvel MCU releases. That's how I keep...
I see the date daily. I work in a job where I look at a lot of dates.
Yeah, but it just washes over you, doesn't it?
I mean, I'm at the point where I don't think it's that important.
I still put 24 sometimes.
But, so, this is getting on for being 40 years old. Isn't it weird that, in my head, the 80s are 10 years ago?
So I think it was 20 years ago, because I wasn't really concerned about stuff going on when I lived in the 90s.
In fairness, in my head, the 80s are 20 years ago. Not 40 fucking years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting to see how far comic books have come, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
When you're looking at stuff like this, because it does look dated, noticeably dated. And this isn't even the golden age of comic books. That was the 1960s. This is sort of...
This is tail end of this... I mean, Silver Age was definitely 70s. Normally you judge it by like the content of what's in the comic books, and that comes with like the whole Comics Code Authority and stuff, and I think we'll get that more into that with the overall story.
Comics Code Authority was happening at this point, though, wasn't it?
Yes, it's on the covers of these, like the original covers.
Yeah,
and it says like approved by the Comics Code Authority, which is a whole bit on again too for why they did some of the stuff in the story as they did. Couple of other bits on the art. I think like you said, consistency, the proportions, body proportions, very good, and tying in that with the fight scenes as well.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things where, again, Daredevil, you kind of have to nail those things because he is a physical fighting character. So you kind of have to get those right. Great snow effect in the snowing. Not quite to the level where
you like snow, don't you?
Not snow and rain, but only in comic book form. Not in real life, obviously. But it wasn't quite to the level of like, what was it, the Deviant, which like felt really like constricting and obstructing. This was just a nice kind of like, it feels like a bustle of a blizzard kind of thing.
We've talked about this before, but for new listeners, Ryan likes snow and rain in comic books.
Yeah, when done well.
What is it you like about it?
I like the effect because I like when, because you don't see it very often, I like when either like a proper monsoon kind of rain coming down or a blizzard actually makes the panel feel like it's obstructing the person in it.
Yeah.
Like, it's one thing when you get a character who's just standing in the rain and it's just, there's an effect of rain. It's another thing when you can actually see like the rain is like collecting on them and coming down on them and stuff, or the blizzard where it's literally hard to see and move in it.
And drawing water is notoriously difficult.
Exactly.
It's really difficult.
But the standard is just lines, just little lines. That's rain. So when you can do any more than that, I think they did that very well in Kraven's Last Hunt.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of stuff I'm like, that's a good effect.
And capturing the light through water is quite cool, isn't it? When you see the play of the light on the water, and it's done really well, and you kind of get a sense that you're there. It is quite, it's quite immersive, isn't it?
Yeah. And the only other points were One, I like there's a lot of times with Matt Murdock has the shadow over his eyes when he's like not wearing his glasses or whatever. I think that's a nice little kind of like visual reminder of like what this character's experiencing in that if you can't see their eyes, that's like almost like a subconscious, that's not what he uses to, to sense the environment and stuff. And the other one I thought was really weird. I don't know if you noticed this as well. There's a couple of points, at least two I can immediately think of, where Matt Murdock is complaining about the cold. He's in bed complaining about the cold, and both times he has a duvet or a blanket,
which isn't on him,
just like half on him at best. And he's like, "God, these New York winters are so cold." It's like, pull the blanket over yourself. Like, what are you doing? That's like, it's like that guy, the meme of the guy who shoves a stick in his own bike and then falls over, and he's like, "Oh, like, put the cover on you."
I once saw a photograph of a dude, right, and he had a cap on backwards, pair of sunglasses hanging on his necklace, and then he was using his hands to shield his eyes from the sun.
I've seen that,
And it's like, what the fuck are you doing, guy?
he's not thinking about the use of his attire at all.
No, he's brought equipment with him and he's not using it. Instead, he's shielding his eyes with his hands.
That's a problem when you prioritize fashion over function, yeah? One day problem. One thing I thought was interesting, panel layout, which we rarely mention, but this gets a mention because I just appreciate it. One. It's, I mean, especially in this panel layout, the panel layout here is just generally like, it's quite quick in places, like it's like dialogue or fight scenes or whatever. One I particularly liked was there's a origin, it shows his origin, or it shows part or origin, and it's good that it's from his perspective and the initial accident happens, and then it's all black with occasional moments of font coming in through the black of like someone he knows, recognizes speaking. And I thought that, and every time you had a long vertical panel,
like a column,
showing him now just asleep in a shitty bed, like in hard times. I thought that whole thing was quite an interesting, unique way to show the Daredevil origin.
I would agree.
I thought I'd give special mentions to that. So, story.
So, Kingpin. I thought Kingpin was a Spider-Man bad guy.
Yeah, originally, and a lot now still as well. But he's also simultaneously Daredevil's most prominent villain as well.
So Daredevil never really got his own BBEG?
His closest one you could probably say is Bullseye. But even he, because he's
is he a guy who sees really well?
No, he throws and hits, like he could throw things with a bullseye accuracy.
Right.
But he also likes not using guns and stuff because he's a psychopath. So he likes like throwing like forks and knives at people or whatever, but also killing them like quite strongly as well. But because he's a mercenary or that kind of thing, he's normally hired by Kingpin. So it kind of and I think it's one of those things as well where Kingpin is the Kingpin of New York, which is why he was a Spider-Man villain at first.
Yeah.
And then I think you get to points like, well, Daredevil's this street level guy who's fighting street level crime. Where does that eventually lead? Well, the Kingpin of crime.
It leads to Kingpin.
Yeah.
So are there Spider-Man Daredevil crossovers? There must be.
Oh yeah, there's loads.
Because we don't meet Spidey here, do we?
No, it's not every comic, but there are a lot of crossovers. There's a lot of crossovers between all those New York, especially the street level New York ones.
Well, we see Cap, don't we?
Yeah. Well, Cap is an interesting one because he lives in New York, but he's more Avengers, so he's more like kicking about globally rather than just in New York. There's a lot of Punisher Daredevil crossover. Because they just kind of in those similar circles. And I think they always are an interesting like philosophical debate whenever you have them interact.
Because they have very different ideologies, don't they?
Exactly, yeah. And then Doctor Strange, he's normally kicking about because his thing is in somewhere like, was it Times Square or somewhere like that?
It's in Manhattan, isn't it? It's in a nice bit of Manhattan.
Yeah. Surprised you don't get the Fantastic Four that much because they're in New York. But again, like the Avengers, they're bloody going to space and shit.
Yeah. So was Stan Lee from New York then?
Yes. The Marvel building was in New York, which is why a lot of them are.
Those writers were just walking around New York imagining superheroes swinging around on the buildings.
Exactly. And Stan Lee literally made a point of like when he first imagined Spider-Man, he was imagining him swinging past his window. Yeah. And obviously he's looking at New York with the skyline and be like, well, this is where Spider-Man could do web swinging.
Yeah, I've often had this thought. Imagine if Spider-Man had lived in Lakenham.
Well, there's a bit in Homecoming, the first of the MCU ones, where he's trying to get somewhere in the suburbs, and he literally like runs into one part and it's just an open field with no trees or anything. It's just like, and he just starts like absolutely pelting it down,
booking it. Yeah, I've often wondered this, like how useful though would if Spider-Man had like come into his powers in a city that wasn't quite as tall as New York, would he have even ended up being Spider-Man, or would it have been like, well, this is a fun party piece, but functionally pretty useless?
Well, Daredevil gets around pretty well in Hell's Kitchen area, so that is less of the skyscrapers and stuff, and he does more of a parkour thing over building. Yeah, I can't remember off the top of my head. I've seen it on a map before, but I can't.
I want to
say
remember. I've walked through it.
Possibly, it was bad, like crime-wise in the 80s,
which is why it was called Hell's Kitchen.
Exactly, but since then it's definitely got a lot more gentrified and stuff.
Most of the island has these days, hasn't it?
Well, people just want to be as close to the best parts of the island, and then naturally that just gentrified most of the areas, didn't it? I think it was funny when Netflix did the Daredevil series in, I can't remember what year, 2012 maybe or something.
Yeah.
But they were like, had to be like Hell's Kitchen, like the pit of crime in New York City, where it's like, don't look at it in real life. Just imagine it's like from the 80s.
It's really nice now.
Yeah, but it's just pretend it's bad still.
Yeah.
But yeah. So, story-wise, and also spoilers for a comic that came out 40 years ago, as we've established, I dare you to tell us what the story was.
Well, Matt Murdock, essentially...
Who is Daredevil,
gets his life good and fucked up by the Kingpin, loses all of his nice things and his nice apartment, and his girlfriend dumps him, and he ends up homeless and has to fight his way back to being Matt Murdock and Daredevil again.
Yeah, you've nailed it. That's probably your best summation of a story, I think. It's a simpler story.
It's because it's a pretty paint-by-numbers story.
Yes.
And this is where I get to the point where I don't particularly want to talk about the comic book anymore, because that's kind of all I have to say about it.
But we can also critique it, which is the interesting point. I think what people come to us for.
So, it is too monologue-y.
Yeah, 100%.
It's too monologue-y. It's far too dialogue-rich. And I'm sorry, Frank Miller, but 40 years ago, you weren't writing particularly interesting dialogue.
Yeah.
It had some fun moments, but everything that I found compelling in it was fleeting. And there were compelling moments. There were some story beats that I thought were really cool.
Yep, same.
The one that I've hit on is Matt Murdock asleep in that dumpster, because that is quite a powerful image. Like a wealthy New York lawyer asleep, homeless in a dumpster is quite a compelling image. And I think, they always say most of us are like 3 paychecks away from being homeless and will never be billionaires.
And that's very, I think, well demonstrated in this story.
I mean, that was artificial because it was clearly the Kingpin.
Yeah.
Bullying people and cajoling people into freezing his assets. And, he was like, oh, I keep paying my bills and they're not getting paid. And it's like, I wonder how that's happening, Matt.
Oh, yeah. And he is like, he's not like, oh, I guess this is fine. Like,
no, he's like, this is an issue.
Yeah.
And then the moment where Kingpin is training and he takes on all those black belts.
Yeah.
And he's just a big fat guy.
Classic villain. That I think was happening before that became such an overdone trope.
Yeah.
Because you see that's like Naughty's, I think, was prime for that. It was like the villain, he's training himself by fighting all these expert fighters, and he's just absolutely rinsed all of them.
Yeah.
Imagine what's going to be like when he fights the protagonist.
And he smashes his teeth in.
Yeah. That, I think, became rife after this.
Yeah.
This was still at a time where it was like, bloody hell, Kingpin's powerful. Like, it had the intended effect back then.
But no, I mean...
He also did it looking like a baby in his, like, sumo suit or whatever.
With his gut hanging out. But no, so there were story beats that were fun. In terms of the style and the way it was constructed, I think I'll approach it from that angle first.
Sure.
The Irish Girlfriend was written fucking horribly.
I was actually anticipating how you were going to feel about that.
She was just written really badly. And
do you mean specifically Irish accent representation or just general as a character?
All of it.
Okay.
I didn't like any of it.
Okay.
So they attempted the accent in the worst way because...
A lot of yees.
Yeah.
How dare ye?
Which made her... So firstly, Americans think that's a feature of Old English, but that character is actually...
Yawn, was it? Thorn? Have I ever got that? Called Thorn, isn't it?
Yeah.
I know things.
That character is actually a TH.
Yes.
So when you see ye olde something, it's just how they wrote TH. It's the.
Yeah.
It's the Old English character for the.
But also, it is fun to say ye olde tavern.
It's not, though.
It is fun.
It's just historically inaccurate bollocks. And so...
Fun bollocks.
and really, they were saying ye as in you, but that's just not how an Irish person sounds. And...
You know how that kind of stuff turns out, I think, is literally some film somewhere cast someone in a role that they are not equipped for at all.
Yeah.
They just spurt out some bollocks as an accent, and then that gets repurposed within modern media at the time.
Yeah.
And then people are like, oh yeah, that's the accent. And someone has to be like, no, one person got it wrong and you all just took it as face value.
That's where all the stuff came from in Pirates.
Yeah.
Because there was one chap who was cast as a very prominent pirate in a film who happened to have a Cornish accent. And for what? I think that was in maybe the 50s. And for like 75 years now, pirates sound a bit West Country for no good reason.
We said that on the Creature of the Black Lagoon episode, where when they were making films in that time and they just started getting sound for films, they were just hiring the same old actors who had got famous from silent films, and they were like, do a pirate accent or do an Irish accent. They were like, I'll put one on that people will believe. They didn't even think that far. They just went, yeah, I can do it, and they just did some bollocks.
There's some fun, interesting things that have come about because of that early age of Foley. You know, frogs go ribbit.
Ribbit?
Ribbit?
Yeah.
There's only one species of frog that does that, and it's native to Northern California.
Do you think frogs outside of that area get really offended if you say, oh, do you ribbit? They're like, that's a harmful stereotype that one of our species does.
I think that species may now even have been like I think there might have been an extinction event when they were developing the cities in California that those frogs are like really rare and protected now. But yeah, and so the accent was jarring for me. And again, I know this is like a point of contention for me, and it's probably something that 99% of people would neither notice nor care about, but it bothers me.
Oh yeah, the whole point of podcasting as a medium is to have pedantic complaints about things.
Yeah.
If you wanted proper unbiased reviews of stuff, like go fucking IGN or whoever is reviewing comics for that. If you want a couple of idiots saying bollocks that does not matter, this is the place.
This is a platform for my own pedantry, isn't it?
Yeah.
And yeah, I just think if you are going to try and represent an accent, then actually go talk to some native speakers and ask them to syllable by syllable phonetically spell out the way they say these words. And if you look at it and think it's a bit impassable, because it usually is, and then you do something else. And there are really stripped back, subtle ways that you can represent an accent. There was something we read recently where they got a British accent really right.
You think Power Fantasy from last week, written by British people?
Yes. Yeah. Magus' accent was pretty nailed on, wasn't it? But they kind of, like, all the dinnies and finnies made her sound a bit Scottish when she wasn't. And again, I know that an American in the 80s probably wouldn't have cared about the distinction between an Irishman and a Scotsman.
I mean, the fact that not enough people cared at all that they managed to do it this way, got paid for it, and no one said anything.
I think it's hilarious, though, because a lot of Americans are very proud Irishmen. A lot of Americans think they're Irish and they're very proud of their Irish heritage. And then this is the media that they were consuming about a country they claim to be from, and they just clearly weren't bothered by it. Because if they were bothered by it, it would have been something that was in the writer's head that they would have done a better job of.
Oh yeah, that's American kind of multiculturalism, like, in a nutshell, basically. It's like, we're multicultural. It's like, no, you're all white Americans. It's like, no, I'm Irish, he's Italian, he's Greek. It's like, yeah, all right, well, I can't be asked to argue about it.
Your great-great-granddad saw a Greek person getting off a boat. You're not Greek.
Yeah. So yeah, it's definitely a thing that's only really more of an issue nowadays because people are actually like defending, like actual Irish people and all others who had this happen to are actually being like, we don't actually sound like that. And then people are like, oh shit, like someone's actually complained about something. We have to change this now.
I mean, again, we have it as English people in American media, don't we? Where it's like, we don't all sound like Benedict Cumberbatch.
To be fair, we have it as English people in English media. There's an advert right now for from the makers of Peaky Blinders. They're making a show in Victorian London, boxing, like underground boxing set in that time, starring Stephen Graham, prominent British actor, very good British actor, a lot of stuff that I really like. I highly rate his work.
Stephen Graham being Cosmo, Boiling Point, that guy.
Yes. Most notably, I can't remember his name, but in Snatch.
Yeah.
Jason Statham's... He was the guy with Jason Statham in that film.
Yeah. But he was also Combo in This Is England.
Yes. And Boiling Point is fantastic as well.
Boiling Point is fucking perfect.
But the issue with this is there's trailers for now, and apart from a couple of what I assume, I don't know enough, there's some black actors who I think playing African at the time, like African imported slaves in London. I assume based on the brief trailer I saw.
Yeah.
Apart from them, all the other characters all sound like Jason Statham. And not just Jason Statham, like Americans doing Jason Statham impressions. They all sound like that. But for even Stephen Graham to sound like that, who is a British person and definitely knows better, he's literally just doing oi, blimey, mate, around here, these parts, like, it's tough, you gotta fight your way out, you know? It's like, and what are you doing?
His accent work has historically been very good.
Yes.
Like, his London accent in Snatch was very good. His northern accent in This Is England, or Midlands accent in This Is England, is phenomenal.
Yeah.
It's almost perfect. Like, you know.
I think there's a thing where they're just trying to appeal to like a wider audience, and they're like, people need to know it's British when they first. Or they're like, people like Peaky Blinders, there's a lot of accents in that. Let's do very prominent accents.
They need to know it's British.
British, like
British.
that.
Oh, British. It's so I didn't like that aspect of things.
Yes.
And then I found the writing stodgy.
Oh yeah, there's a lot.
Very formal, very chewy, and a lot of it. A lot thereof.
And this is what, again, coming back to this point, which I think we're going to labor on a lot, it just was the style at the time.
It was like 40 years ago, yeah.
Still doesn't excuse criticism, but it's harder to criticize a single title for doing it when they were all doing it at the time.
I mean, and we had this with Craven.
Yep.
We had it with...
You see it a bit in, like, The Killing Joke. Like, Moore was, I think, writing to the style... Like, he was a comic book writer writing comic book style. He was challenging conventions and all that stuff, but he was still using the framework, and even in, like, a dialogue sense of comic books at the time.
And it's interesting because language is an ever-moving thing, and the 80s had its own quite distinct linguistic flavour in America. There was a lot of leftover stuff from the 60s, but you know, America wasn't a staid and formal country in the 1960s. Britain was a little bit. Britain was still a bit more like, you know,
set in their ways.
Yeah,
we were an older country, so we're going to be, aren't we?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, but even then, you know, there was countercultural movements, and the Windrush generation were all having children, and those children were introducing white British kids to black culture in the form of ska music, and
their parents were like, absolutely not.
Pretty much. Yeah. Or fucking A, yeah. It was an interesting time to be English in the 80s.
And then someone was like, why don't you listen to The Police? The white man's reggae.
Do you know The Police?
The Police are actually pretty... I should say I like The Police, but
I like The Police.
That's what they are.
But they have an album called Reggae de Blanc.
Yes.
Which is literally the white reggae.
Yeah.
Which is a good album.
I've got a little more respect for cultural appropriation if you're honest about it. Like, this is what we've done.
Not only were they honest about it, they made a joke out of it.
Yeah.
But Sting's voice, man.
Right.
Like, I find it a bit...
I enjoy it. I wouldn't say it's...
Yeah. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. We're going to retell one joke that someone else told for my comedy years.
Yeah.
And it was just a guy who did a really good like loop pedal bit with stand-up comedy. His name's Sam Rhodes, still performing now. If you're in London, you probably can see him if you look him up. And he did a bit about one of his friends used to think that SOS meant sack of shit because like a boat's going down. Like,
SOS.
No, it's help. The SOS. The boat's a sack of shit. It's going down. Like that. And then he would do the entire intro of Message in a Bottle by The Police, sung the first verse.
Yeah.
And then when it got to chorus, went, I'll send a sack of shit to the world. It's a good bit. It's a great bit.
Have you ever heard Sting's Loot album?
No, I've heard of a reference in like meme form, but no, I've not listened to it
So
properly.
Sting was in some, I think it was the 90s or the 2000s. Sting became quite a passionate lutenist and made a whole album, and it's got like Oh Dry My Tears and stuff. Like it's got Sting's version of Lacrymae Provence on it. Lacrymae Provence is like a really important piece of British music, like kind of one of the only pieces from the era that's really survived the way it has. It's actually a really interesting, fun album, but it is just Sting singing medieval music over a lute but he still sounds like Sting vocally, which doesn't fit.
It's a very Sting thing to do. I'm told.
Also, have you seen his
album that he did with Shaggy?
I was about to say the tiny desk concert he did with Shaggy, where Shaggy added a verse to Englishman in New York.
I mean, they did that tiny desk because they released the album in like the noughties, I think.
Did they? Was it that long ago?
I don't know when it was. I thought
it was more recent than that.
Maybe it was more recent. So back to the comic. Dialogue, narration, very stodgy, very heavy. So I agree with you there. I think comics were all across those decades. I think they were all replicating that detective noir monologue where they just explain everything, like how they're feeling and stuff. I think they were, even by then, I think they were still reconciling with being a book with pictures. Like, I think you had people. I think you had
Do you think?
I think you had writers who maybe. At that point, like, these are the writers who were happening now, because this was around the time of, like, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and stuff. Like, I mean, they were 60s, but you had, around this time, you had the writers who would become the writers that would influence people to become comic book writers.
Yeah.
But I think these writers were book writers, for lack of a better term.
They were people who had always imagined themselves to be authors who had ended up doing this.
Yeah, and that's pure speculation. Like, I can't prove that. I don't have any reference for that. But it makes sense in terms of just, the decades and what they probably grew up with and what have you. So I think even then they were still reconciling with, I want to get across all of this information, but I can't do it just with panels, so I'll do a narration. And I think they were thinking of that, again, the detective noir thing where you have a monologue running over and it's just telling people how they feel and stuff.
Yeah.
But they were also putting in a lot of exposition, which didn't help.
It makes it really difficult to wade through. This wasn't a challenging read, but it
was a lot.
It was long, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Those 6 issues did not fly past.
The other thing that I think doesn't help, I think it explains why comics like this at this time were like this, is because a lot of their sales hindered on people picking up a random issue from the newspaper stand or whatever it was.
Yeah.
I think even this was 80s, no. 60s definitely, and I think the style continued. They were hoping someone would just pick up from a newspaper stand and buy that issue. But in the
80s, there would have been dedicated comic book stores.
Yes, and that's why I was about to say there was, and I held myself off from saying that. But I think the style that was trying to get people to buy, and even with comic book shops, people buying random issues at a time to be like, oh, I'll get this week because the cover looks cool.
Yeah.
And I think there was you see it, every issue begins, there's always a mention of Matt Murdock becoming Daredevil.
Yeah.
The origin, how it happened, and recapping previous events.
Yeah.
And I think even back then, not like nowadays, you don't have to say who Batman is every issue or his backstory, and you don't have to do it with Daredevil like in these days. But back then, every issue could have been someone's first issue. And you had to they felt like they had to squeeze in. I think there's something that it changed about the 80s, 90s, where they would just put a wall of text on the kind of first page. And it's just like, and they do it even now, in the modern day. Here's how he got his powers. Here's who he is. Here she is. And here's what happened last week.
But it's interesting because remember, the cultural context here is that this came at a time when kids didn't have access to their own screens. The TV was a big thing that
you were lucky to choose what was on it.
Yeah, it would have been in colour at this point.
Yep.
For most households. There might have been some cable going into it at this point.
Yep, definitely.
Particularly in America. Less so in UK. We still only had 3 or 4 channels in the 80s, didn't we?
We had 4 channels, and that's how we bloody liked it.
Yeah, Channel 5 didn't launch until like 1990 in the UK, did it?
Yeah.
And cable...
it's been shit ever since.
Yeah.
It's never been good.
And cable TV would have been a thing, but only a thing for wealthy families in the 80s. And so kids couldn't just take them off and enjoy media that was created for children in that kind of form. So this was the prominent media for kids.
Yeah. And the thing that they could just grab and choose a thing and it was theirs and consume themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, you could, and again, in the 80s, you would just send your kid off to the comic book store on their own. You wouldn't be taking them. They'd fuck off on their bike with their pocket money, their allowance, if you're American, and buy this comic, right?
Yeah.
And to think that the media created for children in that era, like kids really had a choice between this or these comic books, or like a cassette tape or a vinyl LP. as their media that they could go and have and consume alone in their bedroom or whatever.
Yeah.
To think that this was media for children, and it's so staid and it's so stodgy. Being a kid in the older people, older millennials romanticize being a kid in the 80s. It sounds fucking miserable based on this.
But you're comparing that to your experience now. Like, if you never had anything else, you'd be like, this is great.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
This would have been... Did you think this would have been exciting, though, at the time?
Well, apparently it was. Like, all references, the reason this task specifically, and Frank Miller's run on Daredevil generally, which I can only assume was written in the same style as he's done this, was lauded at the time as being some of the best comics that were coming out.
And it is quite... I mean, there's some mature themes that are handled quite well. Like, the whole Matt Murdock's life falling apart.
Yeah.
I think that is a good allegory to give to children in a capitalist society for not being a total fuck up.
And getting across the idea that this stuff, like, losing all can ruin your life.
Yeah.
But you've not lost everything. And there's another side, and it's not the end of the world if you lose a job or a house or a girlfriend. Like, that kind of stuff.
Totally. So I think on reflection, there are some like important messages for young people here. And I can see why it was lauded. Because as I say, there are some adult themes that are dealt with really well. And they took, because like you think of, particularly nowadays, you think of comic book stories and it's all cosmic and time travel. And
a large part of it is it seeps into
it's Marvel's whole fucking shtick.
Yeah.
Whereas this is quite a grounded story about a man losing everything.
Yeah. I mean, there was still cosmic stuff going on at that time. Like, and there's stories that might, whether this deep or not, but are ground level as well. I think the problem is a lot of Marvel, the viewpoint of Marvel from a lot of casual fans to even people who really like it, but their perception is framed by the biggest, most important stuff, which is the MCU and what's happening in it.
Yeah.
So now that the MCU is at the time travel and because they weren't like first Avenger, that first run of the single films and then the Avengers.
Yeah.
None of that stuff really. Like there was Cosmic Cube and stuff and a bit of space, but it was mostly Iron Man armor, Cap in the war, Thor doing whatever Thor was doing. But that was how Marvel was viewed at that time.
Yeah.
And now that you've got all this other stuff and these other concepts that are the most prominent things in the MCU, people just think that's all Marvel. And I agree with your kind of point. Like it wasn't the way in the 80s, because if you could read this comic and not read any other comics and so, Marvel's really like kind of deep and like does important topics and stuff.
Because this is quite grounded and quite mature.
Yeah.
There's very little shenanigans.
And to the point, when you say about like comparing to say Monday, well, like we're talking about like trying not to compare it to Monday comics.
I think we kind of have to though.
Well, I say the more important in terms of why it was received as well as it was at the time, you got to think what it was compared to what else was coming out at the time. I think most other comics at this time were doing this amount of narration and dialogue with nowhere near the quality that this has.
Or the level of depth.
Exactly. So imagine reading a bad version of this, having to read all that narration and dialogue, and then just being like unhappy with it at the end.
Because I think like if I was a kid in the 80s and my friend had been like, oh man, I'm really into comic books, do you want to come to the comic book store with me on Saturday? And I'd seen a rack of comic books and I picked this one up thinking it looked good and read it, and then gone back the next week and ended up with Craven, I would have felt really let down by Craven.
And even Craven was still one of the better ones.
Yeah, and this is why I picked it, because Craven wasn't even that bad.
Yeah.
Those bits of it I kind of liked, but this is so much more mature.
If you try and imagine, well, what I'm saying by compared to the time, because again, I have barely read any comics from the 80s. We both are suffering from what everyone does, which is the best of the best being picked out and almost defining the era.
Yeah.
Whereas if you actually lived at the time and went to the comic book store, a lot of bollocks, a lot of mid, a lot of absolute shit.
There would have been a lot of bollocks, wouldn't there?
Gets completely forgotten. So imagine picking up a comic and it's got a bit of, it's this kind of style, writing and everything. It's got a bit of bollocks in it with like, it's a character who's used a magic stone to become the whatever. And there's a villain and they're really introduced in a really dumb way, and it's just them talking about a lot of bollocks that you don't care about. Nothing really important happens, no emotional depth at all, and then they win at the end.
Yeah.
And it's just a really hollow like victory because you don't care actually what happened to any characters. Imagine most comics being that.
Yeah.
And then reading Craven's Last Hunt and this.
Because what I can say for this is that I can particularly the Kingpin and Matt Murdock, I can appreciate their character motivations. I can appreciate why they're doing the things that they're doing. Like, the Kingpin has turned his attention on Matt Murdock because he is a nuisance to his business.
Yeah.
So it's a simple character motivation, but it doesn't need to be any more complex than that. And it makes all of the Kingpin's actions make sense, and it really sets the Kingpin up to be what he's meant to be, which is this ruthlessly meticulous and deeply effective man. He has the reach and the power to stop Matt Murdock's bills getting paid, to freeze his bank accounts. You know, he's taking away all of the tools that you need to live a functional life in the 1980s. And then Matt Murdock, his response to that is like bumbling around trying to rebuild his life and trying to survive all of these cataclysmic events. And I can see the motivation. I can see all of their motivations laid out in front of me. And it does lack complexity, but what's there makes a lot of sense.
Simple and effective.
Yeah, exactly. What is there is effective. And if you cut through, if you lost like 30% of the dialogue and the narration in this, it would be a stonking comic book.
Yeah.
This would be a really, really enjoyable, engaging reading experience were it not so cluttered. And when you look at it, it physically looks cluttered, doesn't it? All of those narration boxes, the square yellow ones and the blue ones, really clutter the art experience. And on reflection, that may have been what turned me off the art, is that just scanning it, it looked cluttered. And I think that's something that modern comic books can do a lot better, is that if you take something like Tom King's Supergirl run, even though that was quite narration heavy, it didn't look cluttered in the way that this does.
Didn't put anywhere near as much in a single panel at one time compared to this.
Do you see what I mean about it looking cluttered, though?
Full agreement, yeah. I think, thinking about it, I think the editors at the time obviously had a lower standard for that kind of stuff. And I think with comics, we've seen it's a more recent medium compared to like books, but less to obviously film and television. But I think with this, we've seen how the evolution of, at some point, some comics came out which didn't do as much narration, but got across the same amount of, basically did a better job of it. And then people went, oh, this is the bar now. And then everyone else kind of tried to catch up to that.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. There's a couple of bits I want to hone into. I don't think they had lower standards. I think they had different standards.
Sure, yeah.
And you said that this is a younger medium than TV, or
no, sorry, not a younger medium than TV. I think were more comic books for a longer period of time than there were TV shows.
But what I think is that actually comic books and TV kind of came to maturity together.
Yeah, you could argue that.
I mean, I think TV
kind of 80s, 90s kind of decades.
Yeah, I mean, TV in the 1950s and 60s in America had a partly utilitarian purpose. Like, if something big was happening in the States politically, all of the TV stations would turn off and they would all show the news. And so comic books and TV kind of are they're of a similar era, and they kind of came to their artistic maturity in a similar era. Like, you think of the great TV shows, like the classic HBO
Prestige TV.
Yeah, Prestige HBO TV, and then Prestige comic books.
Yeah.
You start seeing the really good stuff at a similar time. Like late 1980s, you start seeing these, what are now the most highly applauded comic books. Killing Joke, Watchmen, I mean, basically just Alan Moore.
And Grant Morrison.
But again, they're really celebrated, even though I didn't like that one comic book they wrote.
I mention them in jest, but also seriously for that reason.
Yeah, and then
and Frank Miller to a lot of extent as well.
And Frank Miller, like really, really highly celebrated. You know, this is the point where comic books start to cross over from being populist entertainment at a low price point to being art, right?
Yep.
And then we see that with stuff like The Sopranos. I think The Sopranos was the 90s. Was it the
Sopranos and The Wire, I think, are like the two first ones where people were like, oh, this is better than film.
Yeah, like TV's become special.
Yeah.
And so these two mediums, I mean, there's a decade in it there.
Just a special mention, Twin Peaks in the early 90s as well.
Yeah.
Twin Peaks was that kind of first like, oh my God, there's clues and we can work out stuff. Like,
I was on that stag on the weekend and somebody was like, oh, I've just started watching Twin Peaks because, he died. And I was like, how are you finding it? And he was like, dude, I have an English degree and it's fucking weird. And I was like, yeah, I totally get you.
I actually know the entire meaning of Twin Peaks, and it's because I watched a YouTube essay by someone that was 4 hours long.
Do you think, no, you think you know the meaning of Twin Peaks?
I think I've got it down. I think they got it correct, because what they do is they take every example and use it
they made an argument that you find compelling. I think Twin Peaks is artistry to a level that it resists that kind of thinking.
I'll tell you the one reason which I believe them, or that I think they are correct in that they have correctly got into David Lynch's intention with everything he's done. There were re-showings of Twin Peaks after it got cancelled.
Yeah.
They re-showed on a new channel, and what David Lynch got to do was he got to do a little forward for each episode.
Yeah.
So what he did was he had one of the characters, the woman holding the log, do literally just talk to the camera and say a bunch of stuff, right? Stuff that were 100% clues to David Lynch to be like, this is what it means. If you follow these, this is what it means.
Yeah, but...
And it fits everything they put for that.
But that's authorial intent, and we know that authorial intent is... David Lynch's opinion on what the meaning of Twin Peaks is no more valid than yours or mine.
That's why I said
and so
accurate for what he intended.
That video created an argument that you find compelling, but I think Twin Peaks resists that type of thinking specifically. And I think David Lynch would be the first person to argue with it if you said that you had found the true meaning. His rebuttal would be, well, why is my idea of the meaning of Twin Peaks or yours objectively any more true than anybody else's?
To be fair, if you watch David Lynch interviews talking about this kind of stuff, the way he comes at it is more that there is a true meaning, as in a true intention, specifically the author's intention. And I think he would agree with you in the grander sense of, or death of the author and all that stuff. But with David Lynch, he did say there is an intent, there is a core thing to it all that I know, and I won't say it because telling you, and this is actually part of the meaning of Twin Peaks, the original meaning, is that the answers are bad because that ruins the mystery, which is good.
Yeah.
Mystery actually gives you good stuff to talk about and ponder on, and getting the answers is bad. And that is actually the themes of Twin Peaks in itself as well. But there are specific metaphors for things in it that mean that kind of stuff. Anyway.
But it's interesting to me because this comic book is kind of coming out at a time when TV is coming into that level of maturity.
Yes.
And I think once you have been around a little while, and I know this sounds really pretentious because I'm only in my 30s and we're relatively quite young.
Once you've been around the block a few times like we have.
Yeah, exactly, right. I don't want to be that guy, but also once you've been around long enough to watch fashion come back on itself and to watch trends become circular, you start to think about, the maturity of an art form. So like 2000s fashion is super trendy with Gen Y at the moment. And I remember that when it didn't look great the first time.
Yeah.
And when I was in uni and I was dressing in like full suits with braces and trilby hats, my dad was looking at me and chuckling because I looked the way that he looked in the 80s. And he was like, that looked silly when I was doing it, and now you're doing it because fashion is circular, right?
And fads in general, not just clothes.
Yeah, absolutely. But then you take mediums and mediums that are new. Like TV was an entirely new medium. And comic books was a much older medium because there'd been art and words together in Western culture since the Victorian era. Like we were really fond of political comics then.
Yeah.
And so I'm not saying that comic books were as new a medium as TV, but in this form in the 1980s, like the superhero comic, the American superhero comic, this is the point where it really starts to mature.
Well, this is the
and
80s
come
where
into its maturity.
The darker themes started becoming more prevalent. And I think comic books as a medium did stagnate for quite a few decades.
Yeah.
At least the 70s.
Yeah.
And I think that's twofold. The one being that they didn't have as much of incentive to increase the quality because realistically, comic books were almost exclusively for kids at that time.
And they were selling.
They were selling. So there wasn't a need. There wasn't like TV had more of a pressing thing to be like, we need to be the best thing on TV because we need to get people watching.
Yeah.
A kid was going to buy a comic regardless.
Yeah.
Whereas you would choose to watch a TV show or you just watch something else or do something else.
Yeah.
I think comics had more of a kids or just, but like same with children's films now are more guaranteed to make their money back than any other kind of film.
Yes.
Because parents are going to take their kids to the cinema just to have something to do for the day away.
And in a broader sense, actually, if two adults go to watch a film together, you are selling 2 tickets.
Yes.
When 2 adults take their kids, you're selling 4.
Exactly.
It's simple economics, isn't
it? But the other thing is the Comics Code Authority. I think them in the 60s, I think it was late 60s, I can't remember the exact year off the top of my head, but whenever they came in, because at one point, the golden era, they were doing a lot of crazy stuff.
Yeah.
And then the Comics Code Authority came in because of I think it was it wasn't Satanic Panic, but who was it in the 60s? It wasn't Reagan, it was the 80s. There was some kind of uprising in the late 60s or early 70s.
The president in the late 60s was Lyndon B. Johnson.
Yes, so it was the communist Red Scare thing.
Who was notoriously...
I'm thinking of McCarthy, so I'm the wrong one.
Yeah, so Lyndon B. Johnson was notoriously a bit of a bigot.
Right.
And his whole presidency is marred by Vietnam and the Civil Rights Movement.
Yeah.
And to be honest with you, he was trying to be everything that JFK wasn't. And so he was sort of internally, even though he was quite liberal, and I think under a different political climate, LBJ would have been remembered as a great liberal, because he did have some very strong liberal opinions, but he was always cloaking them in quite right-wing rhetoric to appeal to that sect of American voters who wanted to win the war in Vietnam and, settle the unrest in our streets, those guys.
Yeah, tough on crime.
And yeah, it was an interesting climate in the late 60s, wasn't it? But I think what, to me, I found most interesting about this comic book is that the other stuff from the 80s I've read are the other really highly celebrated comics.
The gems picked out.
And we talk about this darker tone that started to pop up in the late 80s. And this, for me, isn't dark, it's mature. And that's what I find so interesting in it, is that actually there's a level of maturity in it that I don't necessarily think would have been present in comics from an earlier era. But it hasn't jumped ship to just being dark and gritty. It's not that tonal shift towards comic books being darker, but it represents something a bit more mature. And I think I would love to have seen a world where actually this was the path that comic book writers followed, and this was the stuff that they were trying to emulate.
The problem is, I think you've nailed it maybe without realizing, not enough people recognize the difference between mature and dark, or wherever edgy fits into that.
Yeah.
Because 90s became very edgy dark, not mature dark. And I think, again, tale as old as time with the creative business is studios and publishers and executives and whoever getting the wrong message from things being successful.
Yes.
Prime example I always use, Deadpool, when that came out, first Deadpool film came out, did amazingly well, especially for how small a budget it was made relative to other, big superhero films. And people are like, oh, it's great because it kind of skewers the superhero genre a little bit. It doesn't take itself seriously, and it's fun, and it's a unique vision, and you can tell the people making it all very impassioned, especially the lead actor who is like really trying to make this the best possible and really invested in it. All these other little things that just made it so good. And what people took away was 18 rated superhero films. Yeah. And then we got a flood of, like, on the plus side, Wolverine, the Logan was 18, and that was exactly what we needed. Yeah. On the other hand, I think Venom was then 18. It was like, that didn't need to be. Oh, they tried to, and then they didn't because they realized, like, oh, we actually don't need to do this. It was a terrible idea. But yeah, so wrong messages, and I think the 90s was a wrong kind of path taken. Yeah, and it's an interesting distinction I'd never really considered until this conversation, which is that when you say mature content, what you're actually saying is either violent or sexual content. Yeah. And what I actually think of as mature content is content that tackles mature themes. And I mean, there's something inherently infantile about violence. Yeah, it's just base. On the surface level violence for the sake of violence. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's something really base and infantile about it, whereas actually, content about the fragility of human life in capitalism. Because really, that's one of the strongest themes in this story is the Kingpin using the system against his enemy. Yeah, absolutely. It's I mean, again, the idea of an oligarchical force with nefarious intentions taking hold of the capitalist machine and using it to harm people is a theme that is
scarily fucking relevant in America right now.
You know what else is fantastic to support that point as well? When I was last proper up to date with Marvel Comics, which I haven't been for at least a year now, unfortunately, but when I was last looking at it, Kingpin was the mayor of New York City.
Yeah, right? I mean, the idea of like a nefarious or otherwise evil oligarch taking power is a really compelling theme, and there's a lot of media about it because it is inherently quite a scary idea.
Yeah.
And so that to me is a really mature theme that you need to have a certain level of understanding about the world to even grapple with, right? Like, you present a kid this, it's like the idea of an adult losing everything, but it's like, but he's still Daredevil, he's still Matt Murdock, why can't he just go kill Kingpin? And it's like, well, he doesn't have any money. And it's like, but he does have money. It's like, yeah, his account's been frozen.
Yeah.
They've taken away his, systemically, they've taken away his access to these things. And then you kind of, you know, it gets you into thinking about how access to resources is so important, and it's why people remain subjugated, because they cut off their access to economic embetterment, right?
Yeah, yeah. And to survive in this world, you have to be a part of it, and if people literally revoke your access to elements of it, you seemingly don't have anything else. But also the point of this story is, you are still you, and you can build yourself back up without all that stuff.
Yeah, and I suppose that's where the rosy-eyed American optimism comes into it. And actually, I enjoyed that part of the arc as well.
Yeah.
Like, I did enjoy that part of the arc. And that last scene where he's walking away with his girlfriend and everything's been resolved, it feels a bit rosy. And it feels a bit like, oh, it was an easy resolution. But actually, there was quite a journey for him to get there, wasn't there?
The problems haven't really been resolved. He's just prioritized what he actually is taking stock of and actually putting importance on. And he is in that moment, he points says, I'm alive, I'm still Daredevil, like I'm still physically able, I've got this person with me who I love.
Yeah.
I think that's the fact that he's got those is the happy ending. It's not like someone's comes out like, good news, your bank account's been unfrozen and you're back as a lawyer. Like, they obviously did that at some point after this.
Yeah.
But the fact that it wasn't just like the last scene of like, everything's fine now.
Yeah.
I think it was a good ending of him being like, this is actually, I'm fine.
That's
like,
a valid point.
Problems are still problems, but I am fine and I'm content.
How are you feeling about the comic book at this point? Because this is starting to feel like one of those episodes to me where I came along on it. I came in on the fence about it, and actually the act of talking about it is kind of reflective, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
And so I spend like an hour reflecting on it, and I'm like, oh no, actually there are these finer details that I really quite like.
I think I'm in the same position, but obviously we've talked into, conceiving what is so good about it. I've got a couple of issues about it.
Yeah, go for it.
But to keep on the good, there's still a lot of like little parts where I think are representative of like some of the finer points.
Let's talk about your issues first, because they're more interesting to me.
I think one thing that I found odd was there's two elements. Also, there's one major element of this that I read this like years ago, like just because it was the big thing. I remembered like the rough outline of the plot, but I couldn't remember the specifics.
And you're a Daredevil fan, aren't you?
Yes, yeah. And modern Daredevil is my personal favorite.
Yeah.
I can't get into like arguing which is better. But I read this years ago, and I remembered when you remember things differently.
Yes.
Or just even more exaggerated than they are.
Yeah.
I thought the plot point of his mother, the nun, was more important to the plot than it was here.
Right.
So,
yeah.
And what doesn't help is that they make a big plot point when they adapted this storyline in Daredevil season 3, where they did this, which is a great series of television. They had to change a lot of things.
Is this the Netflix one?
Yes, the Netflix one, yeah. But what's odd is the one that's coming back this week, probably has already come out by the time this is out, is called Born Again. But it's not the Born Again story, because they've already done the Born Again story.
It, yeah.
But because he's back with Marvel and Disney, they're like, Born Again.
Right.
Let's use the
Was it a Sony production? Or?
No, it was Marvel Netflix, which was its weird own offshoot kind of thing. It was
I don't know much about that part of the history.
That's a whole other episode of me getting into like, so the rights were with Marvel, but they were using it, all that bollocks.
Yeah.
Point being, I remembered the nun, his mum, the nun, coming back into his life being more impactful. Yeah. And to be fair, I inferred, I think, a lot from this, but I don't think it addressed it clearly in the writing, which is odd for how much writing there was. I'm surprised they didn't find time to get... But
well, there was no space.
Exactly. But so they do a nice thing where they're showing you the origin. And to be fair, this is a thing where normally when they're bringing back a character, and even a character who technically didn't exist before now, because Matt Murdock was told his mother died in childbirth, and that's why he never knew his mum. And that's why he was an orphan after his dad was murdered. Now, what I think is nice is you get that origin and him being comforted by a woman who he senses with the cross, wearing a cross.
Yeah.
And then not only does he recognize the cross later, and that's just, oh, you're the person who comforted me when I was you're a nun in a hospital. Like, that's not that absurd. But he literally goes, and she smells like me. And his senses. And then he's like, are you my mum? And she goes, of course not. I'm a nun. Like, of course not. And he's like, I heard a heartbeat. She's lying. And that in itself was really nice. And they don't do anything with it after that moment.
Yeah, because it was a cool little moment, wasn't it? And it was a nice, again, something that we talked about the other week was interesting uses of their superpowers. And isn't that an interesting use of his power?
This is one of the things I love about the Daredevil character, reading him. People, I would say he's got a consistent high quality of comic books for him. And I think a lot of people, luckily, a lot of the writers do really interesting stuff with his powers. And I think his powers are rife for doing interesting things.
Yeah.
How many powers are totally sense-based?
Yeah.
And to do everything with it. Because even Spider-Man having spider sense, like one of the most famous sense-based powers, all it is just a tingle. And then he's like, ooh, danger. Like, that's it, really. Some people do more interesting stuff, but there's less writers who have done stuff like that. With Daredevil, prime example here, when he is first in hospital as a kid, all his senses are immediately heightened, and it's hell. For one thing, he was hit by a truck and had stuff thrown in his eyes, so he feels all the pain to an insane degree. Like, I think there's a brief little mention, very subtle, of how they've given him drugs, and he still feels this insane pain. Not because the drugs haven't worked, because his senses are so much higher. He talks about the rough sandpaper that he's sleeping on. It's cotton.
It's just hospital grade bed sheets.
Exactly. Yeah. He's kept awake because he can hear everything around him.
Yeah.
And he can't discern even bits from, it's just noise. And even then later as an adult, he can't sleep because someone 2 blocks over is playing a radio, and he can tell that it's half on 2 half stations. And so, Frank Miller, prime example of just writers using the aspects of the character to do this really interesting perception of the character.
It's kind of cool as well, talking about his powers, that this is kind of partially proven in testable fact. Like, when people lose a sense, particularly one as prominent as sight,
that was 100% the inspiration for the character.
Yeah, like a lot of people who become blind later in life do report more like experiencing their other senses more acutely, because I think it might be a cognitive thing, like your brain's just not processing sight anymore, and so there's more.
Or you just, because you're forced to focus on the other senses, then you just better at using.
Yeah, exactly. You know, they're things that you can train your ears to hear pitch better as a musician.
Yeah.
You can train yourself to identify smells better if that's useful to you in your work. And so it's like it's really grounded in the way that the human body actually works, and it's even though it's extended to like a fantastic degree,
yes,
because it's a comic book, it's just a natural extension of a scientific fact, right?
Yeah. And I think that probably was the inspiration for him. Like, what if a character was blind, but their other senses were superhuman?
Yeah.
And then they can still do all the stuff and better than, normal people.
Do you think it's really funny for Matt Murdock when he has to use the stick? Because he's only using it so that people...
Well, if it's normally, and I think is the case here, but that he doesn't have it enough. But when that stick is the same one that he can fold into the billy clubs as Daredevil. So it's that, again, giving him the billy clubs that are the stick is that kind of keeping the... I suppose it's a surface of as the theme of a blind person, within the character. But he's tapping that along, and he doesn't need to at all. Like, normally, and it varies writer to writer, but normally the consensus is, and actually modern day Daredevil, Frank Miller, again with Brubaker with Winter Soldier, Captain America, Frank Miller in the 80s kind of established Daredevil for then on.
Right, so this is really important for the history of Daredevil.
Yeah, not this title specifically, but his run, because he started on Daredevil in 79, so he wrote on it for like 5 years at least, and then came back for this, and then came back again in the 90s and did it again.
Yeah.
The same character. But
was the 90s stuff as celebrated?
It is, but it's hard to tell because all I hear about is Frank Miller and Daredevil, and he did a big stint in the 90s. I would think if that was bad, I would hear that people would be like, only stick to the 80s stuff, don't go to the 90s. Like,
right.
And again, also that 90s stuff was so good. That's why a lot of people credit John Romita Jr. for being a good artist.
Right. So that's where he's getting a lot of his sort of credibility from.
Exactly.
That's
so
interesting.
Yeah. But going back to the mum and the nun.
Nunny mum.
Yes.
Nun.
After that reveal, he then is on the way back, like getting back to himself. But they don't really address that. The way I inferred it was, he thought he'd lost everything. And then in that moment, he's given something back that he never thought he could even get back.
Yeah.
His mother. So I think they should have done more with that, because the fact that I had to infer that, that's for a comic that's doing this much narration and exposition.
Yeah.
It's weird they didn't get that across. But that's how I inferred it. It was like he got one thing back, and that kind of put him on the track of, oh, maybe it's not all done, and I'm there's something to fight for here now. So that was my one of my critiques. I think the other ones were a lot of the same with, as you say, like too much narration. You could cut out at least 30% of it. And
yeah, totally. I mean, I assumed that we would both come away from it with that impression. However, having spoken about it, it's taken that sour taste out of my mouth. Again, this might just be me thinking back on it from a couple of hours ago and not having it right in front of me.
I think if you were a kid or even a teenager or even an adult in the 80s and you were reading this, I think you'd be ecstatic because, again, comparing it to the time it came out. Speaking of the writing, like the specific dialogue, like a lot, when you say there were a lot of nice, good bits in it that kind of kept me going through like the stodgier stuff.
I liked the dialogue notably less than the message, I think.
See, some lines of dialogue, I thought like, oh, those are particularly good. I really liked how the Kingpin was written as a character.
Yeah, I will agree with you there.
He was a lot more blunt and to the point.
Yeah.
Which added to his character being kind of cold and calculating.
And Matt Murdock was generally fairly well written. Actually, in comparison with everyone else, Matt Murdock probably had the most consistent voice.
Yeah. Specific lines from the Kingpin, I thought, like, from the start, when he gets the information of... Probably should have mentioned this if anyone who's listening this far and does know the story of Daredevil, and actually we're going to get into this in a little bit, the whole Karen Page aspect of it. I think that's
we're nearly there.
I know.
We're nearly home.
You were worried we didn't have much to talk about in this.
Well, it's because I padded it out.
No, so I'll take it all out in post anyway. But bit of the story which is kind of important is Karen Page character, she sells the information of Matt Murdock being Daredevil, and it makes its way to the Kingpin.
Yeah.
And so with Kingpin, very bluntly, he's like, everyone who's handled this information, make sure they get killed. Like, I need to be the only person who knows this.
Yeah.
When he gets the information, again, very bluntly, normally you would get that kind of Saturday morning cartoon villain who's like, now I have this, I will ruin his life, like that kind of thing. All he says when he gets the information and he orders the hits on everyone else, and he says, and with this, I shall test the information. And it's such a clinical, devoid of any color line. Yeah. But the fact that it's like that tells you everything. He's already just very calmly like, I'm about to ruin someone's life. Yeah. It's not hate-filled, it's not emotional, and I think that works so much better for the character.
But before I do that, I just need to make sure that this is accurate.
Yes. And also, that test the information, because he's taken enough thought to be like, this might not be true. This might be bollocks. The way he tests is, I'm just going to ruin this guy's life.
Yeah, totally.
And he might not be Daredevil.
Yeah.
But I'm just going to do it anyway. Like, and how cold and calculated that is in itself.
And I'm going to kill a bunch of people in my organization. Yes. Just to make sure this information is secure before I even know if it's pertinent.
And how he knows it works is Daredevil will become a lot more violent and temperamental with his fighting. And that's how his goons... So he's watching on cameras as Daredevil's like beating the shit out of people with more violence than usual and screaming about like, who knows what's happening to Matt Murdock? Like trying to keep the identity and everything. And Kingpin's just watching like, so that information was correct.
Yep, that's the guy.
Awesome. And then even later, then he gets a little more, now that he knows that it's the right information, he now allows himself a little like pleasure in it.
Yeah.
That's when he uses lines like, I must deny myself the pleasure of a killing stroke. That like I could kill him now, but I want to ruin his life first and drive him mental first. Yeah. And then how smart the story's written, Matt Murdock lost everything. He's like, right, I'm just going to go kill the Kingpin. Like, fuck this. I can't be arsed with it. And he's absolutely in no state to do that at all. Kingpin expecting him. And again, that whole thing of like...
hands his ass to him.
That whole thing of the villain be like, I was expecting you. And Kingpin's like, yeah, of course I was. And also, and again, another little smart bit, when all that stuff is happening, the IRS, the case against him as a lawyer, the bank not getting his mortgage payments, he's like, I think something's happening. Like I think someone's doing all this.
Yeah.
Then he's about to go home and the building he lives in explodes.
Yeah.
And I just took that as like, bloody hell, now another thing. But he's like, you couldn't help yourself, could you? All the other stuff, I could chalk that up to someone else. This is a gangster message. The old original use of the term gangster move. It's the Kingpin.
And again, it's like the Kingpin has been so meticulous. Because if he'd just blown up the building that Matt Murdock lived in, he would have just gotten the insurance payout and bought somewhere else.
Yeah.
But it's like, no, I'm going to take away your access to all of your finances and I'm going to buckle your career and then I'm going to take away that last bit of you. I'm going to take away all of the sort of tangential security that comes with finances and then I'm going to take away your physical security. He's literally chopping his way down Maslow's hierarchy.
Yeah, literally. And then that blowing up the building, like that, he could have taken away the property. I mean, the property was being taken away.
Yeah.
He couldn't help himself. He had to do a big special. And Matt Murdock being like, you've given yourself away and you don't realize it. Turns out Kingpin did do it because that's when it comes round to, I was expecting you when he comes here. Yeah. It's not a villain just being like, oh, yes, I respect you. It's like, I blew up the house and to tell you it was me.
Yeah.
So you'd come here in this awful state you're in.
I'm expecting you because I took measures to ensure that you'd turn up.
Yeah. And then how intelligent it is, he doesn't beat him to death in that moment.
No.
Because he says, I can't risk his murder being associated with me at all.
Yeah.
And that speaks to how the Kingpin is in the position he is.
Yeah.
Because he doesn't take risks like that. He is very meticulous and careful. So they have to put his body in an old taxi and chuck it in the water. And he's like, that'll be found in a couple of days and then he'll be dead. And then a little bit I liked is he's going through the found car, talking about it like as if from the police report and everything they found in it. And then just says, no corpse was found.
Yeah.
And then we don't see the Kingpin for a while. I can't remember how long, but maybe an issue or so. When we come back to him, the first line when we come back to him is, no corpse was found. And you see him like on a machine, like lifting weights.
Juicing.
And he says like, I've taken away everything that matters to him. And what I've left is a man who has nothing is a man without fear.
Yeah.
Which is the Daredevil moniker. And I was like, he's going to come at me so hard now.
Yeah.
And it might not be the sad, depressed one. It's the guy you just tried to murder coming back vengeful kind of thing.
But yeah, all in all, I think it's an interesting little time capsule, isn't it?
The last aspect I think you'll find interesting is the use of the Karen Page character in all this.
So who is Karen Page?
Karen Page is the one, she's next of Daredevil, and she, as you see, it's at this point where we start. So previously, as I found out, she left him to go do Hollywood, become a Hollywood star. Turns out it's not gone well for her at all. She's now heroin addicted. She's making porn films because to get money to feed her addiction, and in the desperation sells Matt Murdock's identity to whoever will pay her, and it makes its way to Kingpin. I think with this use of this character in a vacuum is absolutely fine. Like, it's a thing that happens to people because of the porn aspect. It happens to women.
Is
obviously
she a beloved character?
I think, she was. Like, I think the thing about Matt Murdock is he's a bit of a, as the Australians say, he's a bit of a root rat, you know? He's a mad shagger.
Yeah, he's a well-known coxman, isn't
he's
he?
above Nightwing in that regard, I'd say. I'm telling you, he's She-Hulk for one thing.
We have established that Matt Murdock and
Nightwing,
Dick Grayson would have a good night out together.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, they're going like a house on fire. Very moral blokes as well.
Yeah, upstanding chaps who like a good shag.
But the reason I talking about Karen Page specifically is, while I think it's an okay story to do in a vacuum, I think the problem of it is is endemic of the use of female characters around this time, and probably for decades before. The term fridging which I've used before. Do you remember that? I mean, for the listener, if you haven't heard, bridging a character came about when, in a Green Lantern comic, they literally introduced a female love interest in one issue, and then by the next issue, she was chopped up and put into a fridge as a motivation for the male character.
Yeah.
So I think here you do have that element of a female character being put through the ringer in a really shitty position and outcome as a plot point to drive the male character's story.
And it propagates some really problematic opinions about things like drug use and porn.
Exactly. And this was, I was going to come back to, the Comics Code Authority. And you mentioned earlier how they do mature topics, but it's not overly dark. I think that's a happy accident because I think the only way they could do this topic at all at this time was because the Comics Code Authority had requirements. So one of which being, you can't show drug use. You can't show actually being done. Obviously can't show any sexual stuff or nudity or anything like that.
But you can talk about it happening.
Yes. And even that talking is just made some films. It's that vague, just enough that you know what it is. You could have a child read this and not actually understand any of it because it's so vague.
But it makes it quite subtle and nuanced, doesn't it?
And that's what I mean by happy accident.
Yeah, well, I mean, because the one thing we don't want to do here is start making an argument for censorship.
No. But it's more of that creativity that flourishes under restriction.
Absolutely.
But also, and another thing as well is, I'm pretty sure that whenever the Comics Code Authority had a thing where if a character did do any stuff like this, they had to be punished for it.
Yeah.
It had to show that crime and devious activity like this was not good and would lead to a bad life, and there had to be negative outcomes for doing all this. So I think the story is somewhat shaped by those requirements of the censorship at the time.
Well, I mean, nothing's created in a vacuum, is it?
But I think Frank Miller did a good job of, and again, we've had that kind of going around where it's like, what can you do to certain characters? And I think we're at a point now creatively where it's like, oh, you can have people, you can have women and people who aren't white and gay and lesbian, everyone. You can have them being bad people. Yeah. It's not indicative of so that's what you think of trans people if you made them the villain. It's this is the hurdle I think we're trying to get over creatively now. Yeah. Where people, prime example was Kumail Nanjiani. Yeah. He said, I never get any villain roles or anything. Yeah. He got one recently, and it was for a male stripper film, but he played he ironically played the fat evil manager character, even though he was ripped at the time. Yeah. But he made a point of saying, I don't get enough villain roles offered to me or anything, and I want to do them because they're fun and they broaden my roles as an actor. And he's trying to say people don't want to offer them to me because they're scared of making the Pakistani guy the villain in the film because they scared that people are going to be so that's what you think of all Pakistani people do. Yeah. So there is a thing where people, minorities for lack of a better term, are trying to be no, we can be the bad people in your stuff. It doesn't mean anything. Yeah. And I think that's what we have here is a modern telling of the story can have a woman go through all this stuff and it be tackled more, sensitively and, or not even more sensitively, could be tackled in a same way. But at the 80s, she was a tool for the male protagonist story, and that was it's
not passing the Bechdel test, is it?
100% no. But I thought that was just an interesting aspect.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it is really interesting, and I think it's interesting to actually look at the way that the Comics Code Authority and their limitations and their regulations were impacting the actual sort of reality of these stories. Yeah, because you think about it, when you think about censorship, you think about what's taken out. You don't think about what's put in to not get around the censorship, but what has to be done to make the story fit into their requirements, right? Yeah. And so I think that's a really interesting thing that I hadn't really considered because I often don't have that in the back of my head when I'm reading comics, whereas because you know a little bit more about the history, you often do have that in the back of your head, don't you?
And that's why we share a podcast.
And that's why we do this.
And we didn't even have enough time to get into the reporter character, Ben Ulrich, who I think is a really interesting aspect.
I think we have a different approach to this, where I think you're more keen to get everything in that you've written down, whereas
Well, the good stuff, at the very least. Yeah. We didn't have time to get into Nuke, who I thought was a very interesting choice of character for this. Yeah. And we didn't even get to Captain America and his little back and forth with Daredevil, which I thought was interesting. That is all to say, if you've listened to this podcast and you haven't read Born Again yet, if for some crazy reason you enjoy us speaking about comics, even if you haven't read them, we're eternally grateful for you if you do.
Yeah.
But if you haven't read Born Again, we've still barely touched the surface. You can read it and still get a lot from it, is what I'm trying to say.
There's still loads you can get from it.
And also, last point, Daredevil driving was funny.
Yeah, it's a bit stupid, isn't it? But
I mean, he can do it. Like, he knows where everything is. Doesn't know what color the light is, but
this is it. Can he hear the different wavelengths?
Depends who's writing it at the time.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think we've covered as much as we can before we just start waffling about like the details. Which I think is probably less interesting with something like this, because it's, again, on the surface the story is quite not simple but obvious. Again, simple but effective.
Yeah, this is it. And actually thinking about the historical, like where it sits in the history of comic books and where it sits in the development of the medium was for me quite interesting. That was, it's quite nice to do older stuff sometimes and reflect on where the medium has come from and where it's going a little bit, Yeah.
So I think we've done as much as we can on the comic itself.
Yeah.
We did get a comment from the old super fan.
Is Leon been commenting? What's he said?
They've said that. They asked what I thought, maybe what we thought, but I don't think, of the new Captain America film. I've seen it. I'm guessing you haven't.
No.
It was quite mid. Unfortunately, there's some good stuff in it, but it kind of suffered from like not knowing what it wanted to be and a lot of reshoots and oversimplified in the end because they just didn't really know what to do with the character, I think. So mid, worth seeing if you're a hardcore MCU nerd like myself, but if you're not, probably don't worry about it. They asked about my comic stand channel because they thought I might have been joking or doing a bit because I hadn't linked it in the links below. So now it will be linked because it's definitely not a bit. I have actually wasted time making videos, so I'll put that in the links. And they did comment on an old episode.
Wow.
It was actually the Pokemon episode. And they asked for more Pokemon segments.
We have absolutely talked off air about doing more of the Pokemon manga.
And on air.
Oh, did we talk about it on air?
I think we did last week, on air.
Oh, cool.
Oh, if even just you talking about getting a pack of cards and talking about which ones you got that week. Are you buying them still, the cards?
No, I have other financial goals at the moment.
That's fair enough.
Currently, I'm doing my yearly guitar audit.
That's going to take you a while.
So yeah, what I do, for the listener who isn't Ryan, I like guitars. And so once a year, I pull out everything in my collection and give it the old once over, clean them all up, give them a setup, fix anything that needs doing, modify anything I want to modify. And I do that in the spring because I live in the UK and temperature changes are a big deal for guitars. So they get really cold and a little bit bendy over the winter. And so I like to sort them out before the warm weather comes. So I'm currently doing my guitar audit, which is soaking up some of my disposable income.
Fair enough. Well,
so Pokemon cards, and also I've had like holidays and stag do's and shit. So Pokemon cards are less of a concern right now.
Look at you, responsible adult, putting off the Pokemon cards for actual life events.
Yeah, this is it. I'm going to Crufts next weekend.
Wow. Well, tell us all about that. Compare that to a Pokemon event of some kind.
Well, I think so. An announcement is that there is another Jamie podcast in the works. My partner and I are talking about doing a couples podcast because they're popular.
I mean, this one is.
Aw. Imagine if one of us was labouring under that assumption. They're like, my boyfriend only wants to see me when we make a podcast
once
together.
A week when we talk about comic books. I don't even like comic books.
So my partner and I are
making a podcast.
We're making a couples podcast. We don't. I think we have a name for it, but I can't announce it now. But the first episode is going to be recorded either this week or next week. And so there is going to be an upcoming episode about my first Crufts experience.
Wow. Well, check it out.
So if you're only here for me, which I can't imagine why anyone would be listening
or
to...
Or dogs, which would be even weirder.
Yeah, if you're here for the dog talk or you just want more Jamie...
Or just to hear my dog snoring in the background.
Yeah.
Which I don't think gets picked up on the mics, but maybe you have Daredevil hearing.
Yeah, but if you just want more Jamie... watch this space because I'm making a couples podcast.
Yeah, we'll put a link in the description. And little bit of advice, I think, for running podcasts. You know all this stuff, but I think it's good to reiterate. when you've got a podcast, much like this one, it helps if you tell people to find you on all the podcast aggregators and go into the review aspect and give a 5-star review.
That
really helps
it
the
does
podcast.
help.
I'm just telling you.
No,
advice.
I hate that it helps.
Yeah.
And, you can send emails to an email address.
Yeah, like for this one, it would be something like comicglitter@gmail.com as an example.
And then I don't know if like actually going and listening to my other podcast would help. But if you'd like to do that, you can do it. Or if you want to watch Ryan's YouTube videos, you can go watch those.
Yep, Comic Stand channel linked below is what I would say.
Yeah,
if
you want more Ryan or more Jamie, there is more Jamie and more Ryan on the internet.
There's a bit of Jamie on the TikTok for the Comic Glitter TikTok channel, which
I've really dropped off on recently.
Well, you can watch the old ones, and maybe there'll be some new ones at some point.
Do you know what? I really liked that content. I thought that content was really fun.
I think it's the best content of this space that you've made. I think it was good stuff.
Yeah, like the comic book history, the little tidbits, the profiling. I would really like to do actually go off book and do some Comic Glitter episodes where instead of talking about a title, we talk about a figure from comic book history.
I think that'd be great content, 100%. I think that we should save that concept for when we do some kind of like added content for Patreon or something like that.
So if you are a listener, because we have some hardcore listeners now, and I think we're at a point where we've made a lot of content, and we do
Too
have
much, some would say.
Yeah, absolutely, and we do have some like regular listeners now. If you would be interested in some behind the I hate to say it,
additional content.
If you would be interested in some additional content, let us know, because we're not gonna. We've talked about a Patreon or I would rather use Buy Me a Coffee.
Sure.
Which is a nicer system.
As long as I get money, I don't care.
Yeah. If you would actually be interested in some slightly different content that was exclusive for people who are like actually invested in this and
the real fans.
Well, it's different content, isn't it? Because we have to make a podcast that is enticing to new listeners, and we try and do that. If you're interested in some content that is for people who are like already invested and are just like, I want this but a greater level of depth because I'm already into it, and that's something you'd be willing to, do the transactional thing that people do on the internet sometimes, tell us, because we've not done it yet, because we're like, I don't think anybody would be interested in
and
that.
Also, to do it, we would also have to carve even more time out of our routines.
Yeah.
We just about get by doing this.
And I am busy. Yeah. I am a busy person.
So I would say it's not even something we can do right now.
Yeah.
We might be able to do a bit over the horizon when situations change.
Yeah.
But it would be something that we would have to research and all that kind of stuff as well.
Essentially, what I need to happen, guys, is for all of you to mobilize and turn my couples podcast into something deeply profitable.
But do this one first. Then you can do that one.
See, this is the thing. When I told Ryan that I was making a couples podcast, you were like, "Oh, it's a saturated market," and I'm like, "Yeah, people like it."
Yeah.
There's a reason there's not a million comic book podcasts, and it's because it's for this many people.
But we're gonna capture them.
Well, we're trying. We're bloody well trying, aren't we?
We're putting in a graft.
See, look, I can see you like trying to wrap this up now, and it's like, no, I've gotten into the call to action bit and like helps you expand it into a whole conversation.
Yeah, you did a great job on it.
And now you're looking at me like, I want to finish, Jamie.
Yeah, I've got my jollies from the call
I can't fucking win with you, can I?
It's whatever aggravates you the most.
I've been very engaged today. I've been really well behaved.
Yeah, you've done all the great stuff. And you're going to like it for next week, because next week, I'm pretty sure...
Is there Dick Grayson?
No, I won't say even better. Hold off. We're doing the sequel to Nice House by the Lake with a Nice House by the Sea, I believe it's called.
Is there any Dick Grayson, though?
There's not. It's DC Black Label. So it's not impossible that you wouldn't show up in
Imagine if we get to the end of it, right, and everything's gone shitty, and then Dick Grayson as Nightwing walks through the door and he's like, I'm here to save you all. Shag her.
It's me, Dick Grayson. It's like the post-credit scene of the comic. Everyone's like, what? But yeah, I think chances you'd be better off buying a lottery ticket than that. It's not impossible is what I'm saying.
It's not impossible, but it is implausible.
Yes, 100%. And on that note, I think that's
Cheers,
the best way to finish.
Bye.
Thank you, goodbye.